All right, well, it is now noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I will be recording today's session, and I'm going to get that started now. All right, so welcome and thank you for joining the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission for our Fair Housing and Power Hour session on fair housing fundamentals. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator here at PHRC, and I'm thrilled that you're spending your lunch hour with us today. Today we are going to be covering the basics of fair housing. And I'd like to start off by thanking our interpreter, Jill, for making this session accessible today. But let's go ahead and get started. We've got a couple goals for today's training. So if I've done my job well today, you will have a brief overview of who we are as an agency. You'll be able to identify fair housing laws and protected classes. We'll discuss discriminatory practices and what housing discrimination looks like, as well as cover the complaint process. If anyone feels that they have experienced discrimination, that way they have all the information they need in order to get a complaint started. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we're going to answer your questions. So I'd like to invite you to go ahead and put any questions you have throughout the presentation in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and we'll get to as many questions as we can as the presentation goes along, but we'll also reserve some time at the end as well if you have any questions regarding the presentation or general fair housing questions that you'd like to raise. Would be happy to answer everything that I can. I'd also like to invite you to say hello in the chat as well. Feel free to put your name and the agency or the part of the state that you're coming from. Always like to see who's joining us today. So I'd like to start off with a quick overview of our agency. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, or PHRC, exists to fulfill a two-part mission. So the first one is to enforce the non-discrimination laws for the state of Pennsylvania. So those include the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So if someone believes they've experienced discrimination, they can contact our agency and we'll investigate to see if there is a violation of our state laws. That happens with a neutral investigator who will assess the facts of the case before making a determination. But beyond reacting to complaints when they arise, we also work to proactively promote equal opportunity for everyone in Pennsylvania. We do that with a variety of partners. We work with volunteers in our Social Justice Ambassador Program, in our Advisory Council. We partner with various organizations, state agencies, local governments, to spread the word about fair housing rights and responsibilities and resources as well as to do work in our other areas of expertise in terms of housing, employment, education, public accommodations, and commercial properties. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania, so we've got our Pittsburgh region, which is the western third of the state. We've got our Harrisburg office, which serves the central part of the state up into the northeast. And then we've got our Philadelphia office, which covers the southeastern portion of the state. And you can see on the screen what the breakdown of our laws cover. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers the bulk of what we do that provides protections in terms of employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations like public spaces and services, as well as primary and secondary education. Our Fair Educational Opportunities Act covers post-secondary education, such as college, trade schools, technical schools. But now we're going to move on to talk about fair housing specifically. When we talk about fair housing laws, they've got two goals. And the first one often gets a lot of the attention, ending housing discrimination. That's what we're going to be focusing on today as we talk about discriminatory practices, what's outlawed by our laws. But fair housing goes beyond that. Our second goal is promoting diverse, inclusive communities. And in the fair housing world, we call that affirmatively furthering fair housing. Um, that's defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So it's acknowledging that housing discrimination has been a part of our past for a long time. Fair housing laws were passed, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but there have been decades of practices and laws that restricted groups of people from having equal access to housing, from accessing quality housing in communities of their choice. So there's lots of patterns and structural barriers in place that we need to address in order to make sure that everyone in Pennsylvania is able to access quality housing in the area of their choosing. And so we do have further training on AFFH. So I always want to mention it in my presentations, even though that's not going to be our focus today, just to keep both aspects of fair housing in our minds as we're having these discussions. So what do our fair housing laws cover? They cover the sale and rental of housing, as well as housing related transactions. When I talk about housing related transactions, that could be a number of things in and surrounding the provision of housing. So it could be homeowners insurance, it could be appraisals, it could be mortgages and lenders. All of these industries that support the housing process. So fair housing laws do cover those industries as well. And they also cover a broad range of types of housing, anywhere from apartments to single family homes, mobile home parks, manufactured housing, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. Even some types of shelters are covered by fair housing laws. There are two main types of discrimination that we talk about, or discrimination theories. The first one is disparate treatment. That's what most people intuitively think about when they think about housing discrimination. That's defined as treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So in terms of familial status, the presence of children in a family, that's one of our protected classes. Disparate treatment could look like a housing provider denying a rental apartment to a family in a multifamily unit, saying, you know what, I'm not going to rent to you because you have kids. They're going to be too noisy. We've got thin walls and it's going to be too disruptive to our other residents. So we're not going to rent you this housing. They've been denied housing because of their protected class. Disparate impact is often a little bit more subtle. So it's a policy that looks neutral on its face, but it has a disproportionate impact on members of a protected class. So if we're looking at familial status again, it could be a policy that says only one person per bedroom. If this is above and beyond the normal occupancy standards for a locality, and there's no justification for a housing provider to restrict the number of people to such a low level, that could keep families with kids out of housing that's affordable to them, since they would need to purchase or to rent rental housing that had a lot more bedrooms. So it's going to limit the housing opportunities for households with children at a much more significant level than the general population. So of course, localities can have occupancy standards, and typically it's somewhere around 2 people per bedroom. But if it's overly restrictive, that could be an example of disparate impact. We've got various levels of fair housing laws. So there's laws at the federal level. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 provides the basis for a lot of these protections. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act. So these laws provide additional protections for individuals with disabilities on the federal level. As I mentioned earlier, at the state level, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act provides the basis for our protections. And at the local level, there's over 70 different local ordinances throughout the state of Pennsylvania that may provide even more protections. They might add additional protected classes that are not covered at the state or the federal level. So those are important to be aware of. I'd love to hear in the chat if you're aware of any local human relations commissions or ordinances that are active in the area that you live in or that you work in, since we do know that they do exist in many areas of the state. And before I advance to the slide that shows our protected classes, I'd love to invite you also to put in the chat any protected classes that you're aware of. I always like to see how many we can get identified before I show them on the screen. So to give you an idea, there are 7 different protected classes at the federal level, and there's 10 at the state level. All right, thanks, Joanna, for sharing that about the Borough of Dormont that has a non-discrimination ordinance. Wonderful. Does anyone have any ideas, any protected classes? And you can feel free to make a guess. It's okay if it's wrong. I already mentioned the protected class of familial status. Any additional ones that anyone wants to make a guess? All right, we've got a quiet crowd, and thank you so much. Let's see, disability, absolutely. Age, over 40 is at the state level, and then gender would be covered under sex. Familial status, absolutely. Let's see, we also have race, ethnicity. Ethnicity would be under national origin or familial or ancestry. Let's see, got age, familial status, religion, and sexuality would be under the protected class of sex as well. Genetics is not one of the protected classes at the state or the federal level. It may be protected at the local level under a local ordinance, however. So thank you so much for your participation. I really appreciate that. And I'll go ahead and advance the slide so you can see. We did a wonderful job at covering those. So you can see the big 7 at the federal level are race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. You can see that at the state level, those are mirrored very closely, but we also add age at 40 and above, ancestry, and then the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. I'm going to go into more detail about some of these protected classes in the slides ahead. So familial status includes a couple different groups of people. It includes families with children under the age of 18 who are living with parents or legal custodians. It also includes people who are pregnant, as well as people who are securing custody of children who are under the age of 18. That includes foster children as well as biological children. There are a few types of communities that are able to exclude families with children because they're designed for seniors. So this is outlined in the Housing for Older Persons Act. The first type of communities are 55 and over communities. And the characteristics of those communities are that at least 80% of the units have to be occupied by at least one person who is 55 and older in order to maintain their status. They do have to advertise and market as being 55 and older, but only one resident in the unit needs to be 55 and older. Any age limitations that they're placing have to be consistent, and they can deny residency and or access to facilities and services to children and people who are under 55, but they do need to be consistent with the way they apply these rules. Now, 62 and older communities are a little bit stricter. They do require a certification to qualify. You need to be at least age 62 to live there, so no one under age 62 is permitted. So clearly, children would be excluded from these types of properties. Now, there is one circumstance in which someone who's under age 62 might be able to live in one of these communities. Can anybody put a guess in the chat about why someone might be living in a 62 and over community if they're not 62 or older? Thank you, Brenda. A caregiver, absolutely. If someone has a disability, if a resident has a disability, they can make a reasonable accommodation request if they need live-in caregivers, and that's a reason why there might be someone that's younger living in those properties. Want to move on to discussing sex as a protected class under the PHRA. Under the Human Relations Act. So you didn't see sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBTQ listed as a separate protected class at the federal or the state level. However, we did recently finalize regulations back in August of 2023 that established that the term sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, breastfeeding status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, as well as differences in sex development. So that's pretty broad. And the rationale behind this is that if someone's receiving different treatment because of who they love, because of how they express themselves, how they dress, how they identify, that's all intrinsically bound up in sex. So that's why we accept complaints, we conduct investigations and adjudicate cases that do cover these various aspects of one's identity under the protected class of sex. And we do have suppliers and some information on our website with more information about that if anyone would like that information. I know we've been trying to get the word out to make sure that people realize that they do have protections under the protected class of sex, even if those aren't specifically identified as separate protected classes. And the last protected class that I want to spend a little bit more time defining is disability, and that's defined as the physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. So some examples of this include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. Not an exhaustive list, just some examples. So someone might have a disability that's immediately apparent as they come into a leasing office or talk with a mortgage provider or a realtor, but it also might not be obvious. It might be something that's only identified when someone discloses it. Irregardless, someone would have protections under the protected class of disabilities if it meets that definition at the top of the screen. And the Fair Housing Act does offer protections to those who have a disability, who have a history of a disability, and those who are perceived as having a disability. I often get the follow-up question, well, why would someone have protections based on just having a history of a disability or who are perceived or regarded as having a disability? But the reality is sometimes people may be treated differently based on someone's perception of them, based on their knowledge of their history or what they think someone might have. So people need to have these protections to make sure that they're not receiving adverse treatment. And mental health disability is included in this definition. So it's physical or mental impairment. It's pretty broad. All right, so we're going to move on to discuss discriminatory actions. So these are actions that are prohibited on the basis of someone's protected class. We're going to start off with discriminatory statements. That's defined as printing or circulating statements indicating a preference or a limitation related to protected class. You can see some examples on the screen here. New York Catholic School, perfect for empty nesters. New York Korean grocery, or great for singles. Why do you think these are an issue if we're advertising or housing using these types of terms? Why is this problematic? Feel free to enter that in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so we'll keep moving on. But this is, yeah, it's giving hints about who should apply for housing. And if we're saying who should apply, that's also making a statement perhaps on who shouldn't apply. Yeah, it could imply potential bias, excluding folks. So we never want to exclude folks from housing, since it's so important for folks to have equal access to housing. So if you are in a position where you're advertising housing, it's important to describe the characteristics of the housing itself, not who you would think would be a good fit for living there. That's definitely the safest way to approach it. The next discriminatory practice that I want to highlight is making housing unavailable. And that's defined as refusing to sell, lease, finance, or otherwise withhold housing or commercial property. And some examples of this include a realtor who's not showing homes to a Latino couple because the seller knows that the neighbors don't want these kinds of people in their neighborhood. That's an example of steering, perhaps on national origin or ancestry. Another example is a bank who's refusing to lend money to a pregnant woman who, because she can't prove that she will go back to work once the baby's born. So that's lending discrimination based on someone's sex and familial status. And lastly, falsely stating that a property or a unit is not available when it actually is, because the landlord thinks that the prospective tenant is too old to live independently. So that could be on the basis of age or potentially on the basis of disability, based on someone's perceived ability. So folks need to have access to housing. They can't be denied on the basis of a protected class, but they also need to have fair terms. We can't have any discriminatory terms or conditions, whether that's in sale, leasing, or financing. So some examples include charging higher fees for teenagers, which would be familial status, right? Charging an extra security deposit for service and support animals for individuals with disabilities. And then lastly, increasing monthly rental costs, but just for individuals of certain races. That would be discriminatory. So we've established that folks have need to have equal access to housing, the terms need to be fair, but there also needs to be fairness in the way that facilities, services, and privileges are provided, whether that's in connection with the ownership, occupancy, or use of housing or commercial properties. So some examples of discriminatory acts under this section include not allowing children to use a pool, ignoring or taking longer to complete maintenance requests based on someone's protected class, or unequally applying rules or lease provisions. So those are all relatively self-explanatory there. Folks need to be able to fully use and enjoy their housing and not have those discriminatory terms and conditions. As folks are applying for housing opportunities, there can't be any discriminatory inquiries, which are defined as making an inquiry or a record related to protected class in connection with the sale, lease, or financing. So some examples of this include asking if someone has a disability on a mortgage application, or asking a caller who's inquiring about an apartment for their age or if they have children. So housing providers shouldn't be making decisions based on someone's protected class, so there's no need for them to have this information. The one exception for this would be some federally assisted properties that receive their funding from HUD. They do have some requirements to collect demographic data to see who's using their program and applying for their properties. So that would be an example where it's okay to ask for this information, but they aren't making decisions about who's going to get those housing opportunities based on the information that's collected there. Next, I'd like to highlight steering. So that's defined as attempting to induce listing, sale, or other transaction, or to discourage purchase or lease by making direct or indirect references to the present or future protected class composition of the neighborhood. Now it's kind of wonky, right? A kind of wordy definition. So that could look like a realtor who's encouraging folks of a certain race to check out this neighborhood, saying you might be more comfortable here. You might want this neighborhood. Have you heard about this school district rather than that one? Really trying to encourage folks to pursue housing opportunities based on who's living there already, not based on the needs of that household and the specifications of the house that they're looking for. In terms of rental housing, we often see steering as well. So it could look like steering families with kids to a certain part of the property where there's other families with kids. Steering folks based on the language that they speak, where they could be with folks that are of similar language or ethnicity. It does still happen. And it can sometimes happen with the best of intentions, but it's important that everyone have equal access to the information about what housing is available so that way they can make the best choices that they want to make for their household or their family. Predatory lending is another discriminatory practice targeting folks for unfair or deceptive loans based on protected factors such as race, sex, or age. And oftentimes these lending patterns line up with the redlining maps that you may have seen dating all the way back to the 1930s when the federal government set up these maps to show which areas were good areas for investment and which ones are riskier. Unfortunately, they used the factors such as someone's race, someone's national origin, their religion as they drew up these maps, and we're still seeing these patterns today. On the screen there's a settlement from Trident Mortgage Company. Over $20 million based on the way they were providing lending services, avoiding providing services to minority, majority neighborhoods, targeting their advertisements, the language that they were using. And I see Susan's comment in the chat about steering and other practices in the documentary Long Island Divided. That's an excellent resource for understanding some of the comments and practices that we see around steering. And that was a great investigation that was done and published just a few years back. All right, next I want to touch on unreasonable use of criminal history. So this is something that we often see in rental screenings. A lot of housing providers do use criminal histories as they're looking at prospective tenants. And criminal history is not a protected class. We didn't have that on any of the lists, but it's something that we often see in terms of disparate impact. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So because of the way our communities are policed in the United States, often Black and Brown communities are more impacted by policing. So those folks are more likely to have charges on their records, which would limit housing opportunities if housing providers are being overly restrictive in the way they use criminal history. So HUD has guidance in this area. They released guidance back in 2016, as well as last year, and their guidance is that housing providers should never be making decisions based on arrest records, because there's no conviction there, right? There's no evidence that someone actually committed the crime that they're being accused of. A housing provider should also not do a blanket ban, completely banning anyone for any type of offense, any type of criminal history. Instead, they should take a more nuanced approach, considering the person in their entirety, making sure they're using multiple factors when they're looking at approving or denying an applicant. So looking at reference checks, credit scores, income, employment. And when they are looking at offenses on their record, taking a look at the recency, the severity, of offenses, as well as efforts that have been taken since the offense to mitigate those effects. And there's some more details in the federal guidance if you're a housing provider looking on how to use criminal records and how to go about that appropriately. Next, I'd like to touch on appraisal bias. So that's defined as the use of protected classes when determining the fair market value of a property. So someone might be looking for an appraisal if they're looking to refinance their home or to buy or sell a property. And unfortunately, there have been a number of instances of appraisal bias that have hit the news in recent years. Typically, it looks like a household of color who is looking to get an appraisal and gets a lowballed assessment and an assessment that they think is too low. So what some households have done is basically whitewashed their properties. So taking out any kind of pictures that would include their family on there, taking out any kind of art or objects in their home that might indicate their race or their ethnicity, and then having someone who's white stand in for them in the appraisal, whether that's a friend or a family member, or a neighbor. And unfortunately, many times they've found that that by doing this, by making it look like the house is inhabited by a white family, they've gotten higher estimates. And of course, a property should be appraised based on the value of the property itself, not who lives there. And in this country, we do have huge wealth gaps in terms of wealth and home ownership in our country. So it's important that our appraisals are fair. So there have been a number of federal issues that have been taken to address this. There's the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force, and there's a link there on the screen, and you will get all these slides after the presentation is completed if you want to learn more about what the federal government is doing to ensure that there's appropriate training on combating appraisal bias, making sure that we've got a diverse workforce in the appraisal industry, and making sure that folks are not receiving unfair appraisals based on their protected costs. All right, and the last discriminatory practice that I want to highlight is refusing to make reasonable modifications and accommodations. So these are specifically for individuals with disabilities. All of the other discriminatory practices are pretty broad and general to any protected class. But individuals with disabilities do have the right to request reasonable modifications and accommodations that they need in order to use and enjoy their housing. So what's the difference between the two? A modification is when you're making changes to a structure. By contrast, an accommodation is when you're making changes, exceptions, or adjustments to rules, policies, practices, or services. I'm curious if you could put in the chat any examples of either reasonable modifications or accommodations that you're aware of in housing. Anything that you might, any requests that you might have fielded as a housing provider or something that you might have had to request yourself. Thanks, Amy. In addition of a ramp over stairs, that's a reasonable modification. Yep. A chairlift or a walk-in shower, a cutout in your bathtub, kitchen counter height, or ramps. Absolutely. Those are all great examples of reasonable modifications. Does anyone have any reasonable accommodations, changes in policies that they would want to highlight? Right, the handle in the shower, lighted fire alarm, absolutely great modification examples. It really runs the gamut. All right, emotional support pets, emotional support animals, service animals. Oftentimes, individuals with disabilities need these animals to support their ability to live independently. And if a housing provider has a no pet policy, individuals can request a change or exception to this policy to be able to have that animal live with them, so that way they can support them. And with an emotional support animal or service animal, there can't be any types of fees or charges, pet rent, things like that, because these animals aren't pets. They're necessary support for individuals with disabilities. Yeah, the age requirement for the caregiver. Thank you. That's a great reference back to the beginning of the presentation. Absolutely. And we provide specific training on reasonable modifications and accommodations because we get so many complaints around this issue. So if you would like further training on this specific topic, we're happy to provide that as well. So I've covered a pretty broad overview of discriminatory practices that housing providers and housing professionals need to be cognizant of as they're conducting their business. But there are also other issues that that can intersect with fair housing as well. So I just wanted to briefly highlight that. So oftentimes households might be facing eviction, housing affordability, habitability concerns, the quality and livability of the property, access to utilities. These can have an impact on the availability of housing and how people can access housing, and they can be tied up in fair housing concerns as well. So if someone does have questions about if their situation might be a fair housing violation, even if it's not something that we specifically outlined in today's presentation, I do want to highlight that PHRC does have a resource, the Fair Housing Line, and you can see the number on the screen there, 855-866-5718. That's a toll-free number that you can call and talk with our trained staff who can provide guidance as to if something's a fair housing concern and might merit a complaint, or if there might be another more appropriate resource that could provide services or assistance than our agency. All right. And before we close out the presentation and open up to a broader question and answer, I did want to talk about the complaint process. Sorry about that. I want to highlight that we don't ask about immigration status when complaints are filed, and we do not report anyone filing a complaint to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So I know those are concerns sometimes for individuals when filing a complaint, but they can rest assured that that we would not get involved with any of those issues, and that we do provide telephonic interpretation. If someone doesn't speak English, that's absolutely fine, and we can provide interpretation to make sure that they can get the assistance that they need. I want to provide a basic overview of the process. If you've attended other PHRC trainings, you may have seen a really detailed outline of the process, and that is valuable information, but for today's purposes, I just want to highlight that the way that you get started is connecting with our intake team. You can do that by calling the Fair Housing Line. You can call any of our regional offices. You can go on our website, fill out an inquiry, download a questionnaire. Any of those are valid ways to get a complaint started. You can even print out a questionnaire and drop it off in a Dropbox at one of our offices. But you'll need to get started by providing information, your contact information, what you experienced, why you believe it's discriminatory, and who you're filing a complaint against. And then our intake staff will assess the information that you provide to see if this is a situation that we can investigate under our state laws. If it's determined that the complaint is jurisdictional, it's covered by our laws, and if it's timely, which is within 180 days of the date of the last harm, then our intake team can help you to finalize your complaint, and the person who was filed against will be notified. So we call the person who files a complaint a complainant, and the person who was filed against is called a respondent. You'll hear that terminology if you do engage in this process. And simply filing a complaint, that doesn't mean that a complaint is valid or not. It simply means that folks have the right to file a complaint if they believe that they've experienced discrimination And during the investigatory process, that's when we determine what the facts of the case are. So after you move past the intake phase, then you're asked to provide additional information to a neutral investigator, and their responsibility is for investigating if there was a violation of our state laws. So they'll do that by asking for documentation, asking to interview witnesses, to hold a fact-finding hearing, or even going on site, finding other ways of obtaining evidence about what happened. I see a question in the chat about if a complaint needs to be filed by the victim, or can a third party assist. A third party can definitely assist someone with reading through the complaint, help them navigate the process. But the person who experienced the discrimination, it is their primary responsibility to file. In very limited situations, organizations would be able to file on behalf of individuals. So the investigator will explore at every point in the process if it's possible to settle the case before coming to a finding, seeing if there's a way to come to an agreement between the complainant and the respondent. But if a settlement isn't possible, then the case proceeds to a finding. And there's two potential outcomes that can occur. The first would be probable cause. So this means that there is enough evidence to establish that it's more likely than not that discrimination did occur and there was a violation of our state law. If that happens, if probable cause is found, then the case may be conciliated. It might advance to a public hearing in front of our hearing examiner or one of our commissioners, or it might be filed in court. So at this point, our agency is no longer neutral, and the goal is to seek a remedy for the discrimination that occurred because of the violation of our state law. By contrast, if it's no probable cause, that means that there wasn't enough evidence to establish a violation of our law. So at that point, that case would be concluded. Someone could appeal that decision if they felt that there was errors in the investigation, and they can certainly request that if they do that in a timely manner. But for the most part, that's when those cases end. And the amount of time it takes to investigate a case really does vary based on the evidence, based on how quickly people respond, as well as other factors as well. So it's hard to provide an estimate of how long any specific case would take to investigate. But why would someone file a complaint? What can be achieved through this process? There are a number of remedies that can be sought, particularly in housing cases. So someone might be able to purchase a lease or lease a home that they were denied, or stop an eviction that's in process, with the impact being that that complainant's able to access their housing. A reasonable accommodation or modification might be made, which means that their disability housing needs are met and they're able to use and enjoy their housing. There might be changes to a lease or other policies from a housing provider that need to be made, ensuring that complainants as well as other tenants will have fair lease terms and policies going forward. Oftentimes there's posting of fair housing notices, ensuring that everyone has knowledge of their fair housing rights. Many times there's training for respondents that's required, ensuring that folks have full knowledge of their fair housing responsibilities. So they, with the goal of mitigating any mistakes going forward, making sure that they know what their responsibilities are. There could be monetary reimbursement of fees and out-of-pocket expenses. So the complainant's being reimbursed for costs that they shouldn't have to have paid. And then something that's unique as a remedy at PHRC is money for humiliation and embarrassment. That's not available in our other subject areas, such as employment or education. This is similar to pain and suffering. and it's compensation that is provided to the complainant. Lastly, if a case proceeds to public hearing, there may be a civil penalty that's assessed, and that's simply paying the cost for violating our state law. So here are some examples of recent housing awards. You can see it can get very expensive to violate fair housing law, and there are consequences when these cases do go to investigation and to settlement or hearing. We have a number of resources that are available to the public. So I mentioned our Fair Housing line earlier in the presentation. We also can offer fair housing training and consultation. If your agency or organization wants to know more, you've got a specific topic that you want to learn more about, be happy to provide that information to you. We offer these webinars on a monthly basis, the last Wednesday of every month from 12 to 1, just to provide basic information, but we can of course get much more into detail about any of these topics. You can see some of the brochures and the fact sheets that we have available on the screen there, and those are available on our website as well. We also have a program on PCN TV. It's called PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. And we get a little bit more in depth on fair housing topics. It's an interview format talking about a wide range of issues that surround the availability and access to housing. I want to highlight that we've got a housing conference that's coming up. That's going to be on Tuesday, April 16th out in Pittsburgh. So if you're in the western part of the state, we'd love to have you join us. Or if you're in the eastern part, you're welcome to travel to join us. It'll be a free event, and we will be opening registration very shortly. So keep an eye on our social media, on our website. We'll have links to register, and we would love to have a wide variety of folks part of this conversation, whether you're a community member, whether you're a nonprofit, housing, working in the housing field, whether you're a housing professional, a local or state official. We all have a role to play in ensuring access to housing, and we're excited for a really great conference. That is the end of my planned content for today's training. You've got my contact information on the screen there, so I encourage you to reach out if you have further questions, you'd like training, other resources. I'm happy to provide that to you. You can see there's a QR screen on code on the screen. Would love it if you would take out your phone, open your camera app, and take a quick second to complete that. It takes 3 to 5 minutes and provides really valuable feedback on what you found helpful about this presentation and what you would want in future presentations. We do review all of that feedback, and it does influence how we offer training going forward. But at this time, if you have any questions, anything that you wanted to ask and didn't have an opportunity to, I would love to entertain any questions that you have right now. You can feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, or simply come off mute, and I'm happy to answer that, anything that you have to ask. I'll hang out here for an additional couple minutes just in case anyone has anything that comes to mind, but I do want to let you know that we will be sending out this recording as well as the slides, and you can expect to receive that later this week. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our interpreter again for providing ISL interpretation. We really do value your time and expertise in providing this service and helping to make sure that we're making our trainings accessible. I also want to thank PHRC's Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Properties, Caroline Eister, for providing technical assistance with doing all the background stuff to make this training run smoothly. Really grateful for your assistance in this space. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. Since I'm not seeing any questions, we're going to go ahead and close this out a little early, but enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. And I I hope to see you at an upcoming Fair Housing and Power Hour session soon. Take care, everyone.